paranoia. Every attempt to say, well, look, there were films, they were manipulated. And everything, because the enemy is the great manipulator, and so fake news are typically true, and true news are typically false, because the enemy is a great manipulator. The second point is that the enemy is a traitor, so the enemy comes always from within. We have to be diffident, because the paranoid style requires mistrust and diffidence all the time. And the third is, of course, I quote Hofstadter, unlike the rest of us, the enemy is not caught in the toils of the vast mechanism of history, himself a victim of his past, his desires, his limitations. He is a free, active, demonic agent. There is this satanic power that you find in many fake news, particularly when they are about conspiracies, of course, of all kinds.
How about
3 minutes. So I won't wrap up. I'll just finish with Hofstadter. Hofstadter says two important things. Two more important things. One is a tendency to imitate the enemy, which is typical of those who cultivate paranoid ideas. And this is what Hannah Arendt said about Hitler. Hitler created a state which was an imitation of the protocols state never existed. The second is that the paranoid creators of news love facts. They tend to surround their information with a lot of facts that support it. And he said, because he was also a man of great irony, they so much love facts that sometimes they manufacture them. And there is something that made me shiver in reading that, because one way of manufacturing facts may be terrorism. If you think of this between the paranoid style of creating news and the paranoid style of creating facts, may be more related than we think. Thank you very much.
We now will hear from Groshek of the Division of Emerging Media.
Well, while we're getting things set up here, I'll just add a little bit of background as to exactly how I find myself on a panel with three brilliant philosophers when I myself am an empiricist and a social scientist. And the short answer is my most excellent colleague, James Katz, the director of our Division of Emerging Media Studies, asked me somewhat on short notice to fill in for someone who I can only expect had much more philosophical orientation than I possess myself. That being said, I'd like to present a paper here today that I had no intention of ever studying, writing, distributing, or even communicating about. And this all came to light as we were studying in my collaboratory class, a methods of digital media class that I teach here at Boston University, about the election. And what we try to do in that class is to use real-world examples of how we can train our students in collecting original data, doing original analyses, and making some sort of contribution to the ongoing discussion. So before I begin in unpacking this topic, which of course you'll notice was not present in the program itself because I was, again, a little bit late to the game, we want to examine this idea of helping populism win. And this paper itself came about, as I said, as the result of a couple of different factors, not because I set off to to study the meteoric rise and unlikely victory of Donald Trump. In fact, as this debate and this campaign was unfolding, I said, I don't want to study that thing. There will be many, many, many scholars who will be studying this. And so I tried to put my attention elsewhere. But nonetheless, as I watched the events unfold and as we all saw, candidate-elect Trump became President Trump, my class and myself and scholars around the world, I think, tried to understand exactly how this came to be. And in conjunction with Professor Katz, we were looking at the rise of the term fake news on social media and Google and in the media more broadly. And we came to identify that this only happened as a post hoc sort of explanation of what was taking shape there. So there was that which was happening. There was the debate itself. There was my class. And we started to look at some data that I had collected previously on social media use, on streaming television use, on political participation. And at the time we collected it, we didn't even think that much about it in terms of which candidates voters preferred. And at this time, this was just before the primaries began in 2016, and so we had a wide range of candidates. We had Trump, we had Carson, we had Fiorina, we had Sanders, we had Clinton, we had Kasich Cruz, we had many, many candidates, right? And so this seemed to be a viable vehicle for us to examine this pressing issue, but also to incorporate this into a larger study of a paper that we've since submitted to a special call on populism and the press and voting for the Information and Communications Society Journal, which is currently being edited, guest edited by Sven Essinger and some of his colleagues. So what I'm presenting to you here is currently under a second round of revisions at that journal. If you're a reviewer in the crowd, hopefully you find this to your liking. And I would be remiss if I didn't recognize here the great contributions of my colleague Carolina Koch-Michalska, who has an appointment at the Audencia Business School in Nantes, France, as well as an affiliation with Sciences Po in Paris. So I would like to bring, with my conversation, us back around to some of those presentations we saw earlier this morning in the first panel, and so hopefully then bring us a little bit full circle in terms of answering and examining some of those empirical questions now that we've had a chance to reflect richly and deeply on some of the philosophical underpinnings of fake news and its genesis. Importantly, I don't believe she's in the audience today, but my research assistant, Lee Hare, was of great assistance in preparing these slides, and I wouldn't be standing here today without her help. So with all of that being said, I want to take a look at the 2016 US presidential election and examine if, indeed, social media was helping populists win, specifically here in the US. Of course, we've seen so far that the presidential election itself was quite unique from what we could have expected, right? We had this meteoric rise of fake news, this growing increase of populist rhetoric, and the fact that it seemed like, and it was often reported that social media was directly revolved in not only connecting citizens to journalists, but also directly to politicians, as well as one another. And so what we wanted to answer was, how do these differing forms of social media use relate to increased support for populism in both parties? And I think this was one of the really interesting things for us, is that we didn't just want to say it was about Trump, because there's a broader spectrum of debate that's taking place here, and that was taking shape particularly through the Democratic primaries, where Bernie Sanders played a central role in moving the rhetoric, we could argue, of Clinton to a more populist standpoint, as well as on the right side of the debate. And this has been framed elsewhere, particularly in Europe, as an ideological horseshoe of populism. So this phenomenon is not one thing that exists just on the left or just on the right, but something that actually takes shape, this differentiation from the establishment politics to other politics. And so we came at this with one basic question. And so I mentioned here this idea of the ideological horseshoe, which includes the ideas of anti-elitism, a lack of trust in pluralic systems, the fact that we have people who are feeling very low in terms of political efficacy and who have this sense of broad patriotic nationalistic appeals and who feel they belong to a deprived group, right? There's a lot of us versus them othering that's taking shape, and that's being taken advantage of in some ways differently, but ideologically perhaps similar in this horseshoe. And so we set off to test not only this idea of social media and its role in political support for differing candidates, but also how those things might kind of come together in the sense that people that might support a populist like Ben Carson or Donald Trump might, on the other hand, be as likely to support a populist like Bernie Sanders. And is there a connection then between their uses of social media? And here's where I think, with the profound insights of my co-author Carolina, that she makes a careful distinction between differing forms of social media use. As a field, I think we have a tendency to just lump these things together and say people spend so much time on Facebook. They spend so much time on Twitter. They're involved in sharing, commenting, posting. But there's a whole other dimension of just receiving messages and not engaging and being that lurker, or being the sorts of individuals that might go out and be a little bit hostile or aggressive or intentionally seek these spaces to cross ideological lines and contribute to democratic discourse in an uncivil and potentially very unproductive fashion. So there's a fine line we're trying to draw here between democratic discourse, deliberation, and debate, and how does that translate in terms of support? Does it cultivate filter bubbles? And do those filter bubbles themselves contribute to supporting certain candidates? Because we feel that there was this narrative that emerged, particularly after the election, about the dangerous filter bubbles, right? Social media allows people to communicate directly with their candidates, allows people to find fake news, allows it to circulate them, and they become, in some ways, trapped in this filter bubble, unable, it seems, to find their way out. And if only they weren't trapped in this filter bubble, they would be able to find the truth. And if they knew the truth, then they would make the right decision, right? So all of this rests on some ideas of rational, informed democracy, which of course we know is an ideal. So what we wanted to do is to look at this and to examine in a way this level of media theorizing, right? Because if we think back, to the birth of our discipline, speaking to the birth of the communication discipline, we came from an era of strong effects, hypodermic needle models, silver bullet theories, H.G. Wells and the War of the Worlds, and the fact that when everybody heard that broadcast, they went running into the street. That itself has been disputed. And that mythology may in fact be a bit of fake news that we still carry around as a discipline. Of course, we've come a long way since this. So as we saw this happening, when I say we, I mean Carolina and myself, we're looking at this and saying, it seems that there's a step back here. And as a field, I would hope that we could press forward and to use all of the knowledge that we've gained in the last 50 plus, 70 plus years to better understand that media effects are not necessarily homogeneous, they're not uniform, they're not linear, and there are many other things that can take into account differing reactions, support, knowledge, and related effects. So then we came to this idea of social media and the fake filter bubble. And the economist from Stanford, Matthew Genskow, and his colleagues in 2016 and 2017 released a couple of different papers. One of them was just circulated recently in the mainstream press in the last week or so, where they found that growth in polarization in recent years is largest for the demographic groups least likely to use the internet and social media. So this is pushing back against that whole notion that fake news itself is cultivating these filter bubbles, and these filter bubbles are leading to support for certain candidates. In fact, the findings that they presented argue against the hypothesis that the internet is a primary driver of rising political polarization, which again is one of these vectors that we see in America, we're seeing right now in Europe, we saw it in the Dutch elections, we saw it in the French elections, and this is a big point of consideration for us, especially as we think about the rise of populism and how it exacerbates the ideas of polarization. I'm so happy that Jacob Nelson from Northwestern University is here, because he published a very interesting and brilliant piece in CJR about fake news and how it has the potential to be a fake problem. And I'm just pulling, hopefully correctly here, a quote from that article that says, "The fake news audience is small and highly likely to also visit real news sites." So this idea that filter bubbles were boxing people in from seeing diverse sources of information from many well-known and reputable sources has been also contested, and I think he was presenting on that earlier today on his poster. So if you haven't had a chance to see that, I would encourage you to talk to him and have a look at that as well. So I think there is a real interplay at work here, and there is a debate that's taking shape, and I think the question is, where should we find ourselves empirically, philosophically, and what do we do moving forward? I had the great pleasure of attending a fake news conference about 2 months ago at Harvard, where our keynote speaker, Matthew Shudson, was a contributor along with many other figures. And I think one of the main takeaways that I had from there was that we do need to have a sense of urgency. We do need to have a plan. We do need to continue to research, but I think we need to ground ourselves around some empirical data. And that might be computational, it might be based on experiments, it might be based on interviews. And what we did here, as I mentioned, was a bit of survey work. So we guided our study by 3 research questions, the first of which is I don't want to repeat all of these things, but basically we're looking at 3 different forms of social media use: active, passive, and uncivil social media use, and the support of a specific presidential candidate. So this was our Q1. The second research question was those same factors again, social media activity, passivity, and incivility, to a general preference for populism, both on the left and on the right. And the last was to get to the heart of the question, right? Was that support for populist candidates related to having a less diverse social network online and offline? And what we're talking about here is the heterogeneity of our discussion networks. Were people that were using social media more less likely to see diverse sources of information? Were they talking about politics with people not like them? So we tried to put these 3 research questions to the test using this data that I collected, like I said, late in 2015, early in 2016. So we have a generally national representative sample, about 1,100 respondents, and we're reporting only the results here on the 7 candidates that I mentioned earlier: Sanders, Clinton, Kasich, Carson, Rubio, Cruz, and Trump. And part of the reason for that is because we are relying on the rankings of these 7 candidates on a populist spectrum that was performed by, I'm going to forget the first name here, but by Oliver and Ron, who in 2016 published a really interesting piece in the Annals of the American Academy of Political Science called Rise of the Trumpenfolk. And what they did to determine who is a populist and who is not a populist was to actually do a linguistic analysis of what these candidates said while they were on the campaign trail. And they used a combination of qualitative and computational coding to make a general ranking as to how populist each candidate was in terms of us, other differentiations, anti-establishment literature, and they have a wide range of dimensions, including political and economic ones. And what they did is they set each of these candidates from a centrist standpoint, which was closer to 0. The more centrist you were, the higher the score is, the more populist the candidates were. So we see Kasich was the least populist candidate according to their rankings, followed by Cruz, Rubio, Clinton, Carson, Trump, and we see Sanders here is pretty well off the charts, right? So this gives us a spectrum, and it also relieves us nicely of having to say, who's more populist, Ben Carson or Donald Trump versus Bernie Sanders, right? So while this ranking system may be somewhat imperfect, it nonetheless is a good objective starting point for us to jump off and to do some regression modeling with variables that came from our respondents. And here we looked at, in terms of dependent variables, independent candidate support, general support of populism. We did a number of questions around traditional media use. We also looked at social media use. And again, we divided those in terms of active versus passive sort of uses, as well as uncivil social media use. We also collected data on the total time spent on Facebook and Twitter to examine if, indeed, social media helped the president win. As we saw, Donald Trump himself say took shape. Now, as we continued in this analysis, we looked at the idea of filter bubbles, and we measured that. We operationalized that by the political talk network diversity. In other words, were people talking to people that were not like them in terms of political viewpoints, in terms of a number of different economic and demographic factors, right? So were they tunneling in to like-minded others and reinforcing their already shared beliefs, as we've heard can happen? Or were they reaching out and having cross-cutting viewpoints with people unlike them on some dimension? We included a variety of political antecedents like political knowledge, efficacy, and things of this nature, as well as your host of demographics. I don't want to spend too much time on the methodology, and I'm happy to discuss further or share the paper as time goes along. 5. Well, that's great. I'm exactly where I'd hoped to be at this stage. Okay. In terms of our support here, basically in traditional media use, television was a key factor in increasing support for Donald Trump. It was also a factor in increasing the likelihood of support of Hillary Clinton, not Bernie Sanders and not any of our other candidates. It actually decreased the likelihood of support for Ted Cruz and Sanders. In terms of social media use, I think a really interesting thing here, active social media users, less likely to support Trump, less likely to support Clinton, more likely to support Kasich, right? But those that were passive on social media, receivers, those that were uncivil, more likely to support Trump. Our other effects that we see here, we don't have many others except for Carson. But in this case, we see that he's the only candidate, in fact, where the likelihood of support increased as people spent more time on Facebook. In terms of time spent on Twitter, we have non-significance across the board. So this idea that as people were using Facebook or Twitter, social media more, that they would increase their support for certain candidates, for us, especially on the question of our populists, Trump, Carson, and Sanders, simply doesn't hold up from an empirical standpoint with this data set. In terms of our second research question, if we look at that general support of populism on the left and populism on the right, we see a somewhat similar pattern. Traditional media, television, again, it increases the likelihood of support for Republican populism, but decrease that likelihood for Democrats. So we see the opposite taking shape. And again, I think it's a mistake for us as a field to ignore a lot of what's happening in traditional media. Same pattern starts to emerge again here. Active social media use decreases the likelihood of support for more populist Republican candidates, but increases the likelihood of support for more Democratic populists, namely Bernie Sanders when selected with only in Democratic candidates being considered. Passive social media use, uncivil social media use, time spent on Facebook, all significant indicators of increasing the likelihood of support for Republican-style populism. Now, where this all kind of comes together is research question 3, filter bubbles and the support for populists. In short, users with greater network diversity online were more likely to support Clinton. Those with greater diversity offline predicted less support for Clinton, more support for Sanders. Offline network heterogeneity only predicted support for Carson. And where it gets really interesting for us is this last point. Online network heterogeneity, the idea of having online filter bubbles, did not predict support for any presidential candidate. In other words, if you were in some kind of online filter bubbles, there was no statistically significant relationship to supporting any of our candidates. So when we switch to the other idea, not just individual candidates, but general support for populism, we see the same pattern emerge. And I'm going a little bit quickly here in the interest of time. But again, we see that online network heterogeneity, the online filter bubbles, again, did not predict support for populism on the left or on the right. So we start to see a real competition for that idea, right? That filter bubbles and social media use were these predictors of engagement and mobilizing people to support certain candidates, at least as we measured and operationalized it here. We did not explicitly pose this as a research question, but as an appendix. I think it's worthwhile for us to say that when we looked at the terms of social media usage, in terms of both format and time, we saw an increase of online network diversity, not a decrease. In other words, those folks that were on social media more were more likely to have diverse online and offline social networks. They were in more diverse political talk networks. They weren't necessarily cocooned into like-minded others. One important caveat to that, however, which we brushed up against, I think, in the morning presentations, is that as social media incivility increased, it also increased the likelihood of being exposed to cross-cutting ideas, which is to say, if you were encountering information that was at odds with what you already knew, there's a good chance that it was hostile, that it was uncivil, that space of engagement was not necessarily a productive one. So in conclusion, did social media use help Trump win? In terms of active social media use, there was less support of Republicans and Trump. Passive and uncivil, in other words, those people that were lurking or were going out there to be hostile, yes, that increased the likelihood of supporting Republican populists in general and Trump in particular. But again, we don't see this on the on the side of the left. So this idea of the ideological horseshoe, that the same sorts of media effects would result in the same sort of support for populists on the left and the right, are two different things. To answer more specifically, did filter bubbles directly help Trump win? In short, no and no. Did social media use directly lead to filter bubbles? Again, we find here that is not the case. And in fact, we see evidence that the opposite was true, that online social media use increased rather than decreased political talk networks. And then finally, what should we do? Keep calm, carry on our research, and let's trust Matthew Genskow. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, all three. So we're going to try to go over a little bit and still have about 25 minutes or half an hour for discussion. So thank you all very much. It's a bit difficult to summarize this panel, which stretched through history, normative hermeneutics, and the empirical data. I mean, one question is whether the truth moves people. I think this is really a question, because I think there's also some data that shows when the facts are pointed out, it doesn't change the way people vote. So,
so Jacob, I just want to play devil's advocate maybe, or push back. I don't know what I call it, but I thought the slide that you put up about the hypodermic needle or magic bullet theory was really interesting, because if you look at the work of J. Michael Spruill or Jim Carrey, who's a media historian, what they talk about a lot was how... You can't hear me? Okay. Oh, okay. So yeah, maybe I should introduce myself. My name is Julian Gorbach, and I'm with the University of Hawaii, and I do media history. And so I just wanted to play devil's advocate a little bit to Jacob's point, which is that according to a number of scholars like J. Michael Spruill or Jim Carrey, when they've looked at the magic bullet theory, their conclusions have actually kind of gone in the opposite direction of what you were saying, which is that the magic bullet theory was used as a straw man argument to dismiss a lot of propaganda theorists during the 30s because, well, you know, people like Paul Lazarsfeld and Carl Hovland were very eager to get funding so that they could take over the U.S. Department of War's information services. And so to undermine the kind of arguments of the people that came before them, they kind of threw them all under the umbrella of magic bullet theory. And the reason I bring this up is because it brought, I mean, at least from a historical perspective, something I see is that it brought us in this 60-year trajectory of looking in the direction where media was supposed to have limited effects and was not supposed to be a powerful way of manipulating people. And so I think social science approaches for a long time were directed in a way to how media was harmless and media was not coercive, when in fact, obviously, a lot of us have experienced something very differently. So I just want to caution my social science friends and colleagues of being maybe too, what's the word? I don't want to use the word complacent, but too comfortable with the current media environment. Something's obviously deeply wrong, and whether we figure it out or find the quantitative evidence or not, I think it's probably on some level obvious, and maybe sometimes the more carefully you look into it with rigorous scholarship, the harder it is to see. But sometimes it's not that a problem doesn't exist, but we have to find a way to put our finger on what the problem is.
Shall I respond?
yes,
Okay. Yeah, so that's, I absolutely agree with your point of caution. And my role today is not to dismiss the threat or the impact or the potential influence that fake news had, or that the circulation of misinformation on social networks can have on an information environment. And so that's why I tried in my quantitative analysis to couch my findings in that idea of direct sort of effects, right? And of course, you know, as we know, all of this is survey data, it's self-reports. And we know that it's a cross-section in this case, it's one snapshot in time, and people might not be very good self-monitors in terms of how often they're seeing different sources of information. And so I think your point is well taken. There definitely could be something more that's happening here that we're simply not catching. And it could be what I think is it's a mistake if we say like, oh, that social media had no impact on the election at all, because I think that there definitely was a reshaping of the agenda. There was a call to respond to these sorts of things that we were seeing circulated. Famously, the Pope supporting Donald Trump, the gate of the pizza ring, in Pizzagate. You know, like these things I think push the needle to a different place, right? They required some reaction, and the idea that Hillary Clinton during the debates herself calls for her fact checkers, right? This is a change. This is something that's happening. So I'm not saying that there's not something there. All I'm saying is it hasn't come through in this particular examination, and I think it's worthwhile for us to look at these different metrics, look at these different measures, and if there is a dispute, then you know that's the purpose we're all here, right? That's the nature of science, and we debate. Here's what I found, here's what you found, and here's where our findings agree and they disagree, and I think we just continue. And I think it's great that we have these sorts of events, and I'm very happy to be a part of it. I applaud Jim and Azar's not here, and Juliet for bringing us, and all of you here. So absolutely correct, and thanks for your thoughtful comment.
Thank you. We have a reply by...
It's not a reply, it's a comment. Of course, you're right. The silver bullet theory was defined as the theory that never existed because it was sort of a polemic idea. But there is something else. I mean, both the so-called silver bullet in what existed of it and the replies to it were based very much on a linear or dialogic position. I think that what has been changing really in the last 20 years is the information environment. That's I think the place in which we are living now. So much of what we should study is the adaptive behaviors in this situation. Much of what you have said is about things not working in such a direct way, but adaptive behaviors being changing. I don't know if I'm clear, but in my opinion, this is a strategic difference, and it is part of the present information environment, which the old debate about silver bullet and so on could not see because it was more single media and so on. I don't know if I answered to you, but
Thank you. Would you like to add something, Alex?
Sure. One thing I'll add is that, as far as I understood Jacob's presentation, also it was not necessarily the case that there wasn't a concern about the media environment. It's just that when we think about where we should direct our attention there, one place that we should particularly direct our attention is actually the television media environment, and that's something that actually hasn't been getting quite as much press in current discussion because people are kind of more impressed by the shiny new thing, namely social media. But actually, if you look at what is predicting support for a lot of the populist candidates, then something that's really concerning is actually something a little bit older, namely the kind of television news, and that's something that could use a bit more investigation and should be something of great concern.
Please introduce yourself.
Joanne Orevik from the University of Wisconsin. This is for Professor Ortoleva and his terrific fake news history. I'm wondering about, again, the discussion that we've been having about alternative facts, truthiness, fake news, and all that. We see norms disintegrating in so many different ways, but when we look at plagiarism, we still see some standards being held that seem to, let's say, undergird perhaps the journalistic profession, also to some extent the political world as well. I'm thinking of Mrs. Trump and the convention speech that had similar themes to the previous First Lady's convention speech. And I'm just wondering, can you, again, you're probably as aware of both histories. I'm wondering how plagiarism still is something that journalists, fake and otherwise, seem to contend is toxic, lethal, and all of that, as opposed to this slanting of the truth and all of that we see so often. Thank you so much.
Yes. Well, the problem of plagiarism is an enormous problem in this information environment, in fact, because the enormous amount of repetitions that circulate, which is, as Dominique said today, well, repetition is one of the main forces in the internet. So the point is not so much plagiarism as such, but when is repetition forbidden? I mean, in this world of mirrors, where everything is repeated thousands of times, there are some moments in which you should not repeat somebody else's words. And it's interesting because the values that are tied to that are not so much values of originality, of intellectual property, as they are values of being phony. I think it's different. I mean, the case of Mrs. Trump is typical. She's a phony. You see, she's a phony. She's not authentic. The value is not originality; it is authenticity. And authenticity, as we know, is one of the main values of our culture now. But that would take us a lot far away.
Would anyone else on the panel like to respond to that?
I'll make one remark, which is that one thing you might think is that journalists are a little bit too concerned with plagiarism as opposed to a wide variety of other things that might matter in the media environment. I mean, if I was being a little bit more cynical, I might think that one reason journalists are particularly concerned is that plagiarism concerns who among journalists gets credit for various sorts of ideas, and that's something that might be very important to journalists, but a little bit less important to the broader public. You know, if you think of plagiarism, I mean, if it does raise concerns, the concerns are kind of quite different from a lot of the ones that we've been talking about in the conference. Like, you know, if Breitbart plagiarized more from the New York Times, that might make things actually better as opposed to worse.
Thank you very much.
Giovanni Ciampaglia, Indiana University. I have a question mainly for Jacob, but I'd love to hear also the perspective from the other panelists. So I'm very, very glad to see results like these that, in a certain sense, contradict also a little bit this idea of filter bubbles, because we haven't really agreed upon a real definition of filter bubble, echo chamber. I think in the paper you mentioned they have 7 different definitions and so on. You also mentioned the important caveat that the results are based on self-report and so on. So my question is more, where do we go from here? As a computer scientist, I love to go to the social scientists and that they could tell me, oh, you should look at this definition and disregard the others. We know, of course, that the data that could answer those questions in let's say, more authoritative ways are held by the companies, by Facebook and so on, and we don't have access to those in the general case. So I'd like to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, sure. First off, I want to say I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm a Hoosier myself, so it's great to see you here. And my short answer is, what I would love to do is to have some triangulation of the data, right? Which is to say, we can easily ask somebody, pending IRB approval, for their Twitter user handle, right? And we can have that show up in our survey data. We can look at their self-reports, and then we can connect with a computer scientist like yourself or Zara Bastavos or many others that I'm sure are in the room, and we can find a way to put together a narrative or a litmus test of the extent to which what they're reporting on the survey actually coincides with what they're doing on social networks. And In terms of what they're doing on Twitter, it's a little bit easier, and what they're doing on Facebook, of course, becomes much more complicated. I think, you know, as an aside, this is one of the bigger challenges I think that faces us as a field, is we are dealing with data that is, in many cases, almost unattainable unless we are working, you know, within the confines of one of these big agencies, or in some cases, you know, if we have incredibly large research budgets or grants and things like this, and we can buy into those spaces. But I think there are opportunities for that kind of triangulation, and that will help, of course, not only from the standpoint of cleaning our data and making sure that what we're reporting is valid, you know, from a self-report to an actual report, but also I think would just go a long way towards improving the interdisciplinarity of our field and having more definitive answers on really pressing topics. So I'd love to make that happen, in short.
Anyone else like to speak?
Yeah,
to this?
well, there was one thing that struck me very much in Jacob's beautiful paper, and it was about incivility. The fact that there is exchange, but that the quality of exchange in terms of civility is not always so good. In fact, it tends to be, a problem that we have is, let me say, the quality of conflict online. I mean, politics need conflict. Politics without conflict are not politics. But a conflict with a bad quality of exchange is not better than a quality with no exchange. But the problem is, should we forbid people to be unpolite? Because one of the tendencies is the social networks should censor to unpolite expressions, to aggressive behaviors and so on. Or should we consider this to be a symptom of a bigger problem that requires, I think, creating some space for serious conflict, which I think is what we really miss now. Good conflict. That's my answer.
Very good. Alex?
I will just second the fact that I think we need more conflict, but it needs to be of the right kind.
Very good. Conflict drives drama also, right?
Right.
So please identify yourself.
I'm Nathan Matthias at MIT, and I have a question about hermeneutic justice and injustice. I really love how this extension of the idea allows us to think not about just about what's happening with individuals, but also to think about information ecosystems and kind of the complex structural relations that people have around you know, their concepts and ability to understand and express ideas. But I'm curious if you see, if there are kind of analogies or metaphors or structures beyond just balance that you're thinking about or aware of that allow us to kind of meet the complexity of some of those challenges. Because when we're thinking about an algorithm, or when we're thinking about like complex multi-party conflicts around politics, there may not just be two people and a broker who's like allocating advantages. So I'm curious if you've thought about other arrangements that would allow us to kind of broaden out our understanding of that concept.
Yeah, thanks very much. That's a really great question. So let me just say like one thing, and we'll see if this is responsive. So one thing is that, I didn't really go into exactly what kind of fairness would require when we're actually thinking about the kind of broader ecosystem. I mean, something that you might think was suggested in the talk, but I didn't explicitly say, was some kind of thought that there needs to be some kind of balance, right? I mean, that actually is something that I'm not necessarily kind of committed to, because it might be kind of fair for things not to be balanced. For example, if it's the case that, you know, one point of view is much, much worse than another point of view with respect to, say, whether or not it's supported by evidence, you know? So like, I mean, this is kind of obvious, but, you know, there's one sort of problem you might have in the political sphere in which some voice that you think should get a hearing is not given a hearing, but then there's also the kind of opposite problem, which is that there are kind of certain voices that are given kind of an equal hearing when actually they should be given much less of a hearing. You know, say when you're thinking about certain kind of like false equivalence between different sort of assertions about, I don't know, empirical facts, where kind of one kind of point of view is completely misguided in the sense that it's not guided at all by evidence. So definitely one thing you'd kind of want to do in thinking about what a kind of fair allocation of kind of hermeneutic concern would be to take into account things like the called epistemic quality, that is kind of how accurate the kind of inchoate viewpoints are. So that's one thing that would be there kind of besides just that would kind of mitigate against thinking that fairness is to be understood simply in terms of quality. Is that responsive to the question?
I think there's a longer and interesting conversation.
Okay, we'll look forward to having that then,
Thank you. Please identify yourself.
Peter Schwartz. I teach German and comparative literature and film in the Department of World Languages and Literatures here at BU. My question is, I think mostly Jacob, but all of you might have an answer. It's about the uncivil language, which insofar as I've been able to bear exposing myself to it, seems unbearably formulaic. It's the same, almost the same sentences of nastiness over and over and over again, which, you know, I think there's a whole bunch of sort of identification with ego ideals and things going on a psychological level. But leaving that aside, I would be inclined to read what you're seeing as loosening or dissolution or non-existence of filter bubbles as more a hardening and a collision of filter bubbles. This conflict is not productive. The discussion is not dialogic as far as I can make out. What you've got is people who are convincedly within their filter bubbles and looking to collide with others. And that, if that's true, if you agree with that, it would seem possibly to conflict with or argue in a different direction from your idea that there's a correlation between exposure and not being constrained that way.
Yeah, so I love the linguistic angle on this, and I guess my short answer is it's not well reflected in this paper, but with one of my colleagues in the Division of Emerging Media Studies, Lei Guo, we started to put this idea to the test, and we've coded for incivility and its occurrence in larger corpuses of Twitter data. And I'm actually working right now with one of our doctoral students, John Donegan, on doing some machine learning about how we can make these distinctions, so particularly around epithets and expletives, and how these are being used in corpuses of 1 million plus units. And we're finding a lot of interesting results that support the idea that there is a lot of hostility, and it's being communicated in, like you say, very repetitious ways. And I think this reflects the point of my colleagues on the panel here. And when we think about that idea of network heterogeneity, right, that is a big caveat for our study. I mean, it's possible you were exposed to cross-cutting information and you're communicating with others that are not like you, but if that communication is not productive, I think, yes, then it very much puts us back to kind of a square one position. And I feel like as a field, you know, we didn't quite see this coming, and I say as a field, as a media and communication scholar. We've been studying social media use and political participation, engagement, knowledge for years, and as a general finding, meta-analyses have shown that the relationships is generally positive, right? But I think that we've been looking more at those simple checkboxes, right? Do you do things like put a bumper sticker? Do you donate? Do you talk to your neighbor? These kinds of easily measurable things that don't really cleanly get to the quality or the discourse. And so I feel like now if we throw fake news into the mix of an already uncivil information environment, it becomes even more polluted. And I think what's equally important here is particularly in this election, in this space and time, hat tip to my co-panelist here, we're seeing more and more of our information that's being circulated originating from mobile devices. And with some of my colleagues, we've identified that as we become more and more mobile, we become less and less civil. So when we put all these factors together, mobility, incivility, misinformation, fake news, okay, it's a perfect storm, maybe, if you will.
We need a philosophy of road rage.
if you look at enthusiastic responses, they are as formulaic. I mean, the formulaic character is not typical of incivility. It tends to be typical of much of the conversation that goes on. In judging films, for instance, you find a lot of people saying, this is the best film I've ever saw, and a lot of people saying, this is the worst film I've ever saw. And repeating that so many times that you cannot imagine how many worst films of their lives they've seen in a week. So, but this formulaic tendency to extremes in itself, I think, is very interesting to understand. And it made me think of Albert Hirschman, exit, voice, loyalty. Now voice tends to be pretty much what people feel as the most important expression in political, but also in consumption behavior.
Alex?
Yeah, I'll just respond to that last thing very briefly, because I think that is very, very interesting, although I'm not sure if I have such a clear intuition about the trend versus of whether or not kind of voice is becoming kind of more important than exit, because on the other hand, there are also kind of tendencies in the other direction, like, you know, increasing organization of kind of boycotts against kind of companies who people think are participating in the political sphere in a way they object to. So anyways, I'm just making an amendment to that, which I think is, I'd like to kind of think more about it, but I think one kind of interesting political development is also these kind of new avenues in which the sort of exit power is actually playing an increasingly prominent role as well.
Okay, this is very interesting. It's
We're
loyalty that is decreasing.
We're getting close, but I'm going to let
It's
I'm going
loyalty that is decreasing.
I'm going to let Jim Katz ask a question. Oh, Tiffany, would you like to? Okay, please identify yourself.
My name is Tiffany Lewis Lockhart. I work here at BU. I'd like to piggyback off of Peter's point, actually, about incivility and language. So I'm trying to think of how I want to phrase this. You said that when people are coming up against opinions that are different than their own, they tend to be using uncivil language, correct?
So that's the finding that's implied by what I presented here today and supported by some of our other work, yes.
Okay. So my question is, how do we study that when it's something like we disagree about climate change versus we disagree about maybe Black Lives Matter or Planned Parenthood?
So I was speaking just earlier with another one of our colleagues at COM here, Michelle Amazine, about this very thing over lunch. And I'm also doing some work with some colleagues in the business and law schools and medical college in terms of how we combat or intervene in misinformation around medical facts. And the thing I love about medical facts is that they're pretty fixed, right? We can agree about what's the appropriate course of action for decreasing antimicrobial resistance. We can agree about how to treat inflammatory bowel disease. These are medical rotunda of facts that we can benchmark ourselves against. It gets much more complicated when we deal with things that are not in the area of fixed knowledge, right? And even those things that we think are fixed, of course, those can change over time as well. So it absolutely, problematizes this whole issue of how do we move forward in terms of remedying the flow of misinformation, if it exists, around a topic upon which there is limited or no consensus. And I think climate change is definitely one of those things that for some reason, we still are pushing back against, and that itself becomes an issue, and I think this just speaks to that idea of pollution, right? And when I say, social media helping populists win, I think that's one of the indirect paths, right? As the information environment becomes flooded or immersed with non-facts or alternative facts or things that could simply be untrue, then it becomes much harder and much more challenging for science journalists to operate, for fact-based, objective journalists to operate. And of course, this was brought up earlier, about the ideals of journalism and democracy. Maybe we need to switch to a different mode of advocacy sort of journalism, right? mean, so my short answer is there's no easy solution about how we go about solving those sorts of issues, especially when we deal with spaces that are absolutely contested. So, so I think the best thing we can do is to turn our attention to philosophers to help guide us.
Oh, boy. Would you
I
like to
second
ask
that.
a question?
Just a second.
So we're done.
Okay.
Okay, so you wanted to say something, Peppino?
Yeah,
And then
just-
as a philosopher, I will
Just a
close
minute,
this
just a
session with
minute.
some thoughts.
I'm very worried about these things, medical facts, because we are seeing two opposite tendencies that are very dangerous both. One is the tendency to medicalize social problems. It's a way of making objective solutions to problems that are not medical, in fact. I'm seeing all forms of addictions that did not exist before. The other, of course, is the scientifying medicine, that is anti-vaccination and so on. So medicine is becoming the center of the problem now.
So I'm going to close with some thoughts to wind us up from Alan Turing. We would not have the world we live in without Turing. In many ways, we live in Turing's world. And Turing studied philosophy, and we would not have this world without the philosophy that he had studied at length. And in a very late essay called Intelligent Machinery, actually it was a report he wrote in 1948, it's regarded as a founding document of AI, he discussed the idea that intellectual matters are a matter of searching. And he lists 3 kinds of searches. The first kind of search, he's thinking very far ahead, will be combinatorial searches. You have a great deal of data, you've got to figure out an algorithm to sort through. That's the first kind of search. Machines will help with that, he says. Second kind of search is a biological search. There will be a struggle among people, and now with the theory of DNA, he sees machines will be involved in cultivating us biologically. Third kind of search, no machines. It's all humans. He says, I'll call this the cultural search. So I think I'd like to wind this up by saying the real problem is, where do we want to go? The hard philosophical questions. And I'd like to thank our panel for shedding some light on that and the questions too.
I'd like to thank Juliet and her panelists. I'd like to thank the audience. And I thought your invitation to engage in a cultural search is particularly pertinent now. And I invite everyone to go on a little bit of a search in the next room and see what we might have there for you.
Biological too. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you tomorrow.
This is really fun. Yeah.
Yes.
It's like the Hofstadter essays.
The thing about loyalty, is very important, because in the other seminar, my thesis was that power habit is decreasing.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Yeah, and about the exit, you're right, but it's exit with voice.
Yeah. Because I mean, like, I was thinking about it because I'm not sure what to think about it. Because on the other hand, you have all this phenomenon of like defriending or things like this that are extremely like the organization of kind of exit power. You know what I mean? But it is like mixed with voice, and you're totally right. It's kind of like exit, but there's supposed to be some kind of meaning attached to it.
But to revisit Hirschman from this point of view would be very interesting.
Yeah.
But, you can write me, I mean, everybody has my address, and in any case, it's peppino.ortoleva@gmail.com.
Yeah.